Welcome to the first episode of the Actuary Voices podcast, brought to you by the American Academy of Actuaries. I'm David Nolan, the Academy's Director of Communications. Today, Academy Executive Director Mary Downs will be talking with the President of the American Academy of Actuaries, Shawna Ackerman, about her remarkable career and the professional path that led her to where she is today. We'll be continuing these conversations with actuarial professionals over the next several months. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast on whichever platform you're using. Now, let's get to the interview with Shawna Ackerman.
Well, we're here today with Shawna Ackerman, who is the 2018-2019 President of the American Academy of Actuaries. Welcome, Shawna.
Thank you, Mary.
You just came from doing a webinar for us, and I was listening to it and thought that it was very interesting. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, just to let people know that why you came to town today and more about the year that you've been having as president?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I was invited by Bob Berline, who is the chairperson of, or was the chairperson of the Task Force for Big Data and ultimately led to the Big Data monograph, to participate in another webinar for the Professionalism series on Big Data. It's a follow-on. I believe they did one last year. And I was joined by Dorothy Andrews, who's the current chair of the Big Data Task, not the task force anymore, the committee, and Bob. And it was really delightful. I thought that the webinar went very well. It's always nice to be in the same room with esteemed colleagues to discuss very pertinent and topical issues. And I think we did a good job. We had a great turnout and lots of questions.
Why don't you tell us how you kind of got to be here, from not just as Academy President, but how you came to be interested in being an actuary and what your background is?
Sure. So way back when I was a small child, no, I'm kidding. I've always really liked math, and I've always been pretty good at it. So when I got to college, I decided I wanted to have a computer science degree because that was the thing that was in vogue at the time. And I got to my sophomore year, about midway through, discovered that there was no way I was going to be able to graduate in 4 years because the demand for the classes was just so high. I was still taking freshman level classes during my sophomore year. Well, I had been taking math courses throughout because I always liked math, so it was easy enough to cut over. Cut over without really any particular path in mind, thinking maybe, well, I could always be a teacher. And so went on my way, did mostly more probability and statistics and combinatorics and linear algebra things in college. And lo and behold, come along junior year, they started suggesting that we should do some career exploration. Good idea. And so I spoke with an actuary that came to campus. And now I'm going to probably regret sharing this particular story because I might offend some of my dear life actuary friends, and that is certainly not my intent. But the actuary that came on campus was a life actuary, and he described what he did in a day-to-day basis and dealing with mortality and morbidity, and I thought, oh, that sounds so awful. There's no way I would possibly be interested in that. So I kind of set the actuarial track aside. The college I was going to at the time didn't have an actuarial science track, and so I really had no exposure to actuaries except for this one gentleman. So I set it aside, like I said. Well, about a year later, an opportunity came up for a property casualty actuary, but how it was being advertised was really math. And so I thought, well, math, I can do that. So I went to the interview. Of course, you do a little bit of research leading up to it and learn about the property casualty field. And I thought, well, that sounds more interesting to me. And so I pursued that with my first job at the California Department of Insurance.
I don't know if people know that you are currently the chief actuary of the California Earthquake Authority, which sounds like a really cool job. Is that something that you feel like you were preparing for in every other job you had, or how did you end up there?
Yeah, well, it wasn't necessarily something I was preparing for, but in fact, I was. When I was at the California Department of Insurance, I was there during 1994, and that's when the Northridge earthquake struck the Los Angeles area. And that was a large event. unexpected in terms of size and financial impact to the insurance companies. And something you'd have to know, I guess, about California that the listeners may not know is that California is the only state in which a residential insurance company, if they write a homeowner's policy, has to offer earthquake insurance. Consumers don't have to buy it. It's not required, not like wind or hurricane insurance. But the insurance company has to offer it. And so after the Northridge event in 1994, the homeowners insurers realized that the earthquake risk was more significant than they anticipated, much more uncertainty around it. It was back in the day when catastrophe loss models were really in their nascence. And so they basically closed off writing a new business, and it created a financial crisis in the homeowners market. And so the legislature, along with the insurance companies, came to a compromise. And essentially that compromise is the California Earthquake Authority, which serves as the writer of earthquake insurance to any of its participating insurers. So we have about 75 to 80% of the insurance market. And we write earthquake coverage for about 2/3 of the insurance market. Unfortunately, the take-up rate in California is about 10 to 13%. So not that many people buy the product.
Well, California is certainly, does any other state have anything like that?
No, not that I'm aware of. I mean, certainly there are markets for hurricane coverage, but no, I'm not aware of any other state that has earthquake insurance set up the way that we do. In fact, I don't think any other state requires that earthquake insurance be offered, and so it's just entirely private market whether it's available or not.
Did growing up on the West Coast have an influence on your interest in earthquakes?
Not in my childhood, but I moved to Los Angeles when I became an adult. And so the earthquake risk was certainly something that I was aware of. So as I said, I was at the California Department of Insurance when that event occurred. And I actually reviewed the first California Earthquake Authority rate filing. I was the actuary that reviewed it. I rejected it.
Do they know?
Yeah, they do, and certainly they'd know now. What I should say is I recommended that it be rejected. I clearly did not have that kind of authority at that time, or now even. So I recommended that it be rejected, and there were some revisions that were made before it was finally approved. I left the department in 1998, and a couple years later, I guess the CEA must have forgiven me because they asked me to do some consulting work for them. So I did consulting generally, but also for them for about 5 or 6 years, and then decided to get out of consulting and became an employee in 2010, where I've been since.
You mentioned that you were always interested in math growing up. How did you first become aware of that? Was it just always being interested in numbers from a young age, or how did that awareness dawn on you?
Well, I think it was probably I'm a little competitive, and so back when I was a child, you used to do addition tables, and then in the second grade or first grade, I think it was, and then in the third and fourth grade, you moved on to multiplication tables, and I always had to be the first one to finish. Of course, it was really just a memorization issue, but because you get that positive feedback, the interest grew. I remember when I was in the 6th grade, which was when we went into junior high. It was a small town, and so we fed 3 elementary schools into a single junior high. And the first day, the math teacher had the individual elementary people nominate the person that was best at math. So I got nominated for my elementary school, and 2 other boys were nominated for theirs. He sent us out, the teacher sent us out into the hall, and asked the remaining students to guess who was going to be the best student. And then we came back in, and not surprisingly, given the time, I did not win, which may have ignited my competitive streak because I made sure that I was the best student by the end of the year.
That reminds me of the narrative that Mary D. Miller, an earlier president of the Academy, recorded for us in 2015 when it was the 50th anniversary of the Academy's founding. And there's an interesting video on the Academy website called Great Career for a Man, ? And she recounted interesting anecdote. She did not become an actuary at a traditional age. She was later, and of course she's of an earlier generation of actuaries too than you are. But do you have any observations about the either the effect of a career on women, or how are women encouraged or not encouraged? Have you seen anything that you'd like to share with those who are listening about that?
Well, I would say it is absolutely a great career for a woman. It is a great career, I think, for anyone that's dedicated to getting through the exams, which is a big undertaking, but also interested in the type of work that actuaries do. I will say that it has been very encouraging to see each graduating class of new society members, whether that's the SOA or the CAS, be more and more, or even the CIA, the Canadian Institute of Actuaries. I went to their annual meeting just a few months ago. And each class seems to be more and more female. It's not 50-50, I don't think, but it's getting closer. So I hope that women understand that it's a great career and aren't put off by it or not discouraged. And in fact, that they are encouraged to undertake it.
What do you find personally fulfilling about being an actuary?
Well, beyond the just kind of satisfaction of solving problems and kind of puzzles and whatnot, I really like the notion that I'm doing something to help people be more secure, because ultimately that's really what insurance is for, is financial security and peace of mind. And so to the extent I can do my job as carefully as possible to ensure that people have a premium that reflects their risk, that is affordable, and makes a product available, that excites me.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that you have faced professionally, whether from employers or ethically, anything that might be instructive and helpful to those who might listen to this?
I think the biggest challenge, and this is one that you'll see, I think, from the day you become an actuary until the day you retire, is communicating risk. And that could be communicating risk and uncertainty to an individual person or to your principal. And how you communicate over time, I think, changes depending upon who your principal is. When you first start out as an actuary, generally you're going to be talking to other actuaries. And so your communications can be more technical. You can assume a lot of knowledge. And I think it's something to be aware of, that absolutely changes over time, and not to fall into the trap of doing technical talk. But trying to explain concepts and make sure that people understand what you're talking about. The big data seminar that we just did, the webinar, Bob Berline made the comment that, a technical report, if people don't understand it, is of no value. And I think that's absolutely true. And not to throw down precepts from the Code of Conduct, but I will. Precept 4 says that our communications should be appropriate for the intended audience. And I think that's something to always be keeping in mind.
So is it fair to say that communications will be a perennial challenge for actuaries?
I think so. I mean, you can certainly get good at it. You can always be better.
Mm-hmm. What about the education and training that actuaries go through? Do you think there's enough emphasis on communication?
I would say probably not. I mean, the basic education is more keyed toward technical aspects and general concepts. When you get into continuing education, I think there's certainly ample opportunities. The Academy's annual meeting, for example, will give you exposure to different actuaries you can learn from. Just speaking with your peers helps, I think, with communication and seeing what others are doing. It's always nice to select mentors, even if they don't know that they're mentoring you. And what I mean by that is you can read other people's publications if you find somebody that you think describes things well. High form of flattery, right, to emulate them.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about why and how you got involved with the Academy as a volunteer.
Sure, Mary, I'd be delighted to do so. It's actually very much tied to someone we were just talking about, Mary D. Miller. I had heard from several of my colleagues at my consulting firm, or the consulting firm that I was working at, that, Shawna, you should meet Mary D. Miller. You would really like her. And I think that was because Mary had a similar background in insurance regulation, but also because they knew her well and they liked her. Well, I eventually did meet Mary. I became part of the Financial Reporting Council, which was a casualty committee under the Casualty Practice Council, and she was the chair. And people were right. I really did like her, really do like her. And so she inspired me to continue volunteering. It also was honestly something that the consulting firm really encouraged as well, just because it gave you opportunities to write and get your name out there, learn more, and be impactful on actuarial issues.
What about your spare time, if you have any? What do you do in it?
Well, I love to be outside. I love to hike, ride bikes. My husband and I, we don't own a car, so we're always on foot or on our bicycles. I also like to knit, which is a quiet thing to do, meditative, I guess, to kind of calm your mind and get away from math. Although I was interested to hear, or rather read about not too long ago, that knitting is being used to help children learn math, which I thought was kind of exciting. So maybe that can be something I'll do in retirement.
Excellent. You live in San Francisco, right?
I do, yes.
And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the experience of being an actuary in San Francisco. Is there anything different about living there than living in other places that you have been that has affected the way you see your actuarial work?
Well, certainly living in San Francisco brings the earthquake risk to mind each and every day. There are plenty of monuments and displays about the great 1906 San Francisco earthquake, to be sure. But as far as being an actuary there, I'd say it's not really that different from being an actuary in other places, with one key exception, and that was brought to my attention by the chief actuary at Fireman's Fund several years ago, more than several years ago. When he pointed out a very young person to me and said, that person's a fellow already. He's from the East Coast. That's what happens because they're inside all winter studying, whereas we, with our wonderful weather, are out playing.
So as president of the Academy, you've had an opportunity to represent the Academy in different venues, with different organizations. And maybe you'd share with us some of the highlights of the experiences you've had, whether good or bad, doing that.
Sure. Well, I would say on the good side, being the president automatically gets people's attention, I guess, and their ears. So it was really exciting to go to the NEIC International Forum earlier this year with past President Bob Berline and walk right up essentially to the chairperson of AIG and immediately, be recognized and speak with them. So that's exciting because you get to talk to very interesting people. It's also nice, the relationships that we have with the other actuarial organizations. So it's been nice to get to know some of the other leaders and learn their challenges that they're facing and see how they're approaching those things, which we do a couple times a year through the North American Actuarial Council.
Do you see the other actuarial organizations as being very different than the Academy?
I think so. I mean, fundamentally, our mission statements are different, clearly. We're very much, we are entirely focused on U.S. issues and what the U.S. actuary needs to be focused on, even if that is, in some cases, international issues, but really with a U.S. focus. The other really important distinction, I think, is our public policy approach. I mean, obviously, that's a lot of the work that the Academy does, is commenting on and responding to public policy issues, always with an independent view. Other actuarial organizations don't necessarily have that same mission, and so it's no criticism of them, but they may not be independent in their views, and they may advocate for certain positions. Again, that's totally fine, but it's not what the Academy does.
You were a VP casualty some years ago before becoming president-elect and getting into the presidential office. So you have experienced the process that the Academy goes through in reviewing documents and trying to make sure that the product is indeed objective and independent. Would you share any information about that for people to understand more about what the process is like and why it's important?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I mean, it really starts with a first look as far as identifying a topic you're going to talk about. Okay, we've got that. But then the first look is who's going to take, first pen to that topic. And so the first thing that happens is identifying the appropriate person. So here I'll share something that may be unique to the Academy, is we have this very strict conflict of interest policy where we ask all of our volunteers to sign off on, not having a conflict of interest in anything that they're doing. But you also have great staff to kind of help you with understanding how conflicts might be perceived. So for example, there was an issue around catastrophe issues and funding, and I was the CPC vice president at the time, Casualty Practice Council vice president. I thought, oh, sure, this is in my wheelhouse. I can absolutely start writing about this. And I was reminded that, well, it would impact the CEA and it might be perceived as a conflict of interest. And while I might have thought that I could do it without bias, I fully acknowledged that someone else may not perceive it that way. So I dropped the pen and passed it on to someone else. So that's the first thing, I think, is that real critical look at who's going to put their name on this document and will it be perceived correctly. The second thing is then you begin the writing process. And we're technical actuaries again, and the whole issue of communication comes up. Some people are better at it, some people not as good. We get a document out, we get our thoughts out, and then it goes through a rigorous peer review by other actuaries. And then it goes through the Academy's review and legal review and communications review. I think there's maybe 4 or 5 different review processes. I know some people.
There's only 3. But
okay, it feels like 5.
4.
Yeah. I know some people get frustrated with how long it takes, but I've never had the experience that I wasn't happy with the end result. So I think that rigor in the peer review process really leads to a better product. We are all biased in some way or another, and we don't necessarily see it sometimes, so it's good to have that extra level or levels of review during the process.
I hope that these podcasts will be listened to by people who are not actuaries. And if that comes to be, what would you want them to know about being an actuary or the Academy itself?
Sure. Well, for the Academy and the products that come from the Academy, I'd want them to know that really our mission is to make sure that there are sound financial security programs, because that is what gives Americans peace of mind for the many assets that they might be insuring, whether that's a life, your health, or your pension plan, or your car. And to appreciate that we are rigorous in giving independent advice to public policymakers. As for what I'd want them to know about actuaries, I suppose I put a little tear in my eye and go, well, we're people too. No, I would want them to know that actuaries are highly trained, educated people, and that we can have fun. We're not just all noses in books and pen to paper or computers. And that also, as we briefly discussed before, it's a great career for anyone who's interested.
Mm-hmm. The Academy recently announced that it was withdrawing from the International Actuarial Association. Is there anything that you might be able to share with the listeners about why the Academy decided to do that?
Sure. First of all, it was absolutely no disrespect intended to anyone in the International Actuarial Association. The Academy wants to continue its relationships with other actuarial associations around the globe where it makes sense. I think the key point was for us, the Academy, is that we identified that the best way to have an international voice on behalf of the U.S. profession is to be that voice, as opposed to letting our voice filter through a larger organization.
Do you think that the profession is generally headed in the right direction? Do you see challenges ahead that others may not have thought about? Do you have any concerns about the trajectory of the profession?
I'm generally happy with where the profession is going. I think that the biggest challenge will be to remember who we are. There's been a lot of talk about data scientists coming into our space and ourselves being at a disadvantage because of standards that we have that maybe other professions do not have. And as we discussed earlier today in the Big Data webinar, I think that our standards are to our advantage. And I think by being diligent in remembering who we are and that we are a profession, that we'll be strong in the future.
Have you ever had a disagreement with another actuary over an ethical matter that resonated with you in a way that you might want to describe to others?
I think I've been pretty lucky, and I will say no. I have had situations where there have been disagreements, but I think that both parties, myself and the other actuary, were able to discuss it in the context of the code of conduct, essentially saying we should treat each other with courtesy and respect, and also the actuarial standards of practice, recognizing that two actuaries could be looking at the same information and come to different conclusions.
Well, thank you, Shawna. It was a pleasure, as always, to talk to you in any environment and circumstance, but it's delightful to have a conversation with you.
Thank you, Mary.
And that concludes the first episode of Actuary Voices. We'd like to thank Shawna Ackerman for sharing her stories and professional insights with us today. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you prefer and keep an eye out for the next episode. Thanks for listening.